Okay, continuing now again with Greg Bahnsen's book, Van Til's Apologetic. We're in section 4.2, section 2 of chapter 4, the Van Til readings. So we covered last time the stage setting by our mentor, Greg Bahnsen, and now we have a fairly extensive reading from Van Til that Bahnsen has excerpted from the Survey of Christian Epistemology. And this is kind of a tough one to either read or talk about. And I'm not sure exactly why, but I think it's because he covers so many topics, each of which, could be a whole semester-long course to unpack nuances and so forth. So it's kind of a shotgun, mass execution kind of approach to the subject. But the advantage of it is that it kind of clears the stage to highlight the key distinctive of the Van Tilian perspective. The Bahnsen divides this reading into sections that have titles that he supplied. So after an initial section under the general title that he gives called Revelational Epistemology, he then has subtitles, Revelation. So, of course, the punchline is going to be the revelational epistemology. And then he has sections on correspondence and coherence, which are two of the main schools of epistemology. And the punchline here is going to be that Van Til approves of aspects of either of those, but also rejects aspects when they're not framed correctly. And then he talks about method in general, the nature of knowledge, and finally it wraps up with 3 sections on, you might say, logic. The first one's entitled Implication, and the second one, Deduction and Induction, where he makes a similar kind of distinctions that he did with the coherence and the correspondence, namely, the Christian worldview is neither deductive nor inductive as secular thinking projects those ways of thinking, but it has aspects of both that are legitimate. And then finally, he has a brief paragraph on the old a posteriori versus a priori distinction. So, for those of you that are well-schooled in philosophy, some of these distinctions will be obvious and we'll be able to focus right in on Van Til's point, whereas those that have not studied very much philosophy, perhaps even some of these topics or rubrics are going to be confusing and not really clear. So I guess all I would say to that latter group is to try to muscle through this section, and we'll come up for air when it's over. So, the revelational epistemology, starting on page 165. I'll skip a paragraph. Van Til says, "The question we must ask constantly is how anyone has conceived of the relation of the human mind to the divine mind. It is on this point that the greatest difference obtains between the theistic and the non-theistic position. The former cannot think of the human mind as functional at all, except when it is in contact with God. The latter presupposes it to be possible that the human mind functions normally, whether or not God exists." So, just a quick comment here. He's suggesting that knowledge either comes because we are creatures of the Creator, in which case our knowledge has to correspond with God's knowledge. God's knowledge is clearly and obviously prior and exhaustive and normative. And so it's really, in a sense, only to the extent that we are in conformity with the divine mind. Not exhaustively, of course, but following in its footsteps, as it were. Whereas the antagonist is either going to have to sort of grant that general principle, but have kind of a different kind of deity, like a pantheistic or a Buddhist or some other kind of deity, in which case we would wrestle with him as to the defects of his view of the divinity. But more commonly in our culture is the thinker that projects that God is either not in the picture at all, or he is, but is irrelevant as far as our knowledge project. So that we can cut God out of the picture or keep him in. It shouldn't matter because we are what we are. You know, we have whatever our mind is, that's what it is, and we can understand that. So it's sort of Occam's razor, you know, we can slice God out of the picture. And Van Til is saying this is the crux of the issue. Is it the case that the agnostic or atheist can develop a epistemology that's successfully positing independence from God? And of course, we're going to argue that no, that's not possible. If he goes the full atheist route, how is this a little bag of gray matter going to make any contact that's has truth value to the universe outside? And by the same token, we're going to be pointing out that he's assuming that which he should be trying to show, namely that God doesn't exist and that we don't need God to think correctly. Continuing. We must seek to bring the theistic and the non-theistic positions face to face with one another on the central issue of the relation of the finite consciousness to God. The antagonist is not going to be interested in making his thoughts be brought in relation to God, but that's our goal in the course of the discussion. So we're going to show the inadequacy of not doing that and press forward the claim that we're making that hypothesis, that position, that starting point is necessary in order to have knowledge. We may begin the argument by discussing what is involved in the ordinary knowledge transaction of man. Christian theism claims that finite consciousness can know nothing about anything except upon the presupposition of the absolute self-consciousness of God. The non-theistic position holds to the opposite of this. And again, there's a little bit of an ambiguity there, because does the non-theistic position explicitly lay that down, or is it just kind of the environment that he's presuming as being appropriate for the discussion? So in other words, he's assuming, my interpretation would be that he's assuming as just kind of a tacit, that doesn't even need to be mentioned, that we don't need God's revelation. So Occam's razor chops God out from the get-go, as opposed to it being an explicit premise of his theory. The main question in dispute between Christians and their opponents comes out most clearly when the subject of knowledge is discussed. It is then that we must give an answer to the question whether the human mind is able in itself to interpret reality. On this important point, we note that the opponents of Christian theism have taken for granted that which they ought to have proved, namely the independence and therefore the ultimacy of the human mind. Footnote 35. Bahnsen says, with this piercing observation, Van Til indicates that non-Christian philosophy, by its very choice or exclusion of which questions need to be answered, is not at all ideologically neutral, but is at the outset already prejudiced in favor of an autonomous theory of knowledge, despite a lack of evidence for it and a lack of answers to obvious challenges, arising from man's finitude, questions of objectivity and a subject-object relationship like knowing, recognized distorting and relativizing influences, etc. Van Til wrote that there is a bias involved in the question of epistemology even at the very starting point. The antagonist will possibly try to counter this argument by saying, well, we justify our method, like say empirical method, by its success-generating ability, sort of a pragmatic approach. And this was kind of I guess, one of the angles that Dr. Gordon Stein took in his debate with Greg Bahnsen. Maybe I can't justify induction, but after all, it has this great success-generating capability. So again, we would have to be ready to push on that to say, yeah, but if you can't make coherent sense of why it has the success-generating ability, then that just adds to your problem. It doesn't really solve your problem. So in other words, we're granting the success-generating capability of induction and scientific method and so forth. And we're proposing that this success-generating character makes sense in terms of the revelation that we bring to the table from God. And it does not make sense in terms of the worldview, your theory for what man is and what the mind is and so forth, cannot give a good explanation for that. Okay, continuing with the Van Til, page 166. Every system of philosophy must tell us whether it thinks true knowledge to be possible. Footnote 36, Bahnsen says. This takes us to the heart of presuppositional apologetics. In the conflict between systems of philosophy, worldviews, Van Til urged defenders of the faith to challenge the non-Christian epistemologically, not simply about knowing or not knowing God, but about the possibility of knowing anything whatsoever. The struggle between Christian theism and its opponents covers the whole field of knowledge. It is not as though we are at the outset dealing with the question of the knowledge of the world about us, and that the only point in dispute is whether or not God can be and need be known. We may indeed make the question whether God need be and can be known so inclusive that it coincides with the question whether anything can be known. Christian theism's fundamental contention is just this, that nothing whatsoever can be known unless God can be and is known. The important thing to note is this fundamental difference between theism and antitheism on the question of epistemology. There is not a spot in heaven or on earth about which there is no dispute between the two opposing parties. End of the Van Til quote in the footnote. Bahnsen. Non-Christian worldviews cannot give a cogent account of the possibility of rational justification for any belief, that is, cannot make sense out of objective, self-consistent, evidence-warranted knowledge. And I would add, or even consciousness, as well as some other themes that we discussed. But even the nature of self-consciousness, which is presupposed in all of these discussions, that we can make propositions and talk about ourselves making those propositions, the second-order discussion. The anti-theist has to be able to give an account for that also. And if we're just goo that kind of evolved out of the lagoon, what does it even mean to speak of the goo being self-conscious? That's just my addition. Continuing with Van Til. Or if a system of philosophy thinks it impossible for man to have a true knowledge of the whole of reality, or even of a part of reality, it must give good reasons for thinking so. Footnote 37. Bahnsen says, when it comes to scholarship and attempting to be rational in one's convictions, arbitrariness is a cardinal sin. Thus, in the apologetical dispute between the believer and unbeliever, neither side should be allowed to get by with asserting things for which no reasons are offered or could be offered. Presuppositional apologetics does not, contrary to misrepresentations, endorse taking a philosophical position at will, then protecting it by claiming its presuppositional status and refusing to argue, give reasons for it. Quite the contrary, Van Til taught us that unbelievers repeatedly take the most controversial or question-begging stances simply for granted, and that this should be exposed as unreasoning prejudice. At this point in the reading selection, he teaches that both those who claim that genuine knowledge is possible and those who are skeptical about it must be pressed for their reasons. Likewise, Christians must develop our reasons for the answer we give to this basic question. So just to emphasize that Bahnsen here reiterates an important point that pop presuppositionalism often makes the mistake of thinking that the whole argument here is to simply observe that everyone has presuppositions, I have my presuppositions, so you're not allowed to attack my worldview because I'm I've set up my presuppositions as sort of a fortress. That's not the agenda here. The agenda is to describe the presuppositions revelationally, but then defend them as giving the coherence and meaning rationally to the worldview, which the anti-theist is unable to do. So we welcome attempts at attacking our position. Continuing with Van Til. From these considerations, it follows that if we develop our reasons for believing that a true knowledge of God, and therefore also of the world, is possible because actually given in Christ, we have in fact given what goes in philosophy under the name of epistemology. It will then be possible to compare the Christian epistemology with any and with all others. And being thus enabled to compare them all, we are in a position and placed before the responsibility of choosing between them. So just as I had pointed out that Van Til's exposition of metaphysics with the plan of God, the sovereignty of God, and so forth, it's quite different than how metaphysics is taught in school. Well, the same is true with epistemology. He's saying that the true knowledge of the world is possible because it's given in Christ. And again, that's, I think, a kind of a gnomic way of saying that we have the theanthropic man, the theanthropic person of Christ, who is both God and man, who governs the universe and created it, and he has a point of contact with us as a man, but also the foundational, absolute, self-contained knowledge that he has as creator. Well, these are themes that aren't going to come up in an epistemology class whatsoever. But Van Til is saying that, well, yeah, but once you explain these elements that we're talking about, you in fact do have an explanation for knowledge. And this is what we're setting over against the unbeliever. We're placed before the responsibility of choosing between them, and this choosing can then, in the nature of the case, no longer be a matter of artistic preference. We cannot choose epistemologies as we choose hats. Such would be the case if it had been once for all established that the whole thing is but a matter of taste. But that is exactly what has not been established. That is exactly the point in dispute. Well, I'm not sure that's the only point in dispute, but I think what he's saying here is that there's kind of a country club mentality that philosophers have, that, oh, we can discuss Plato's epistemology and Descartes, and at the end of the day, you pays your money and you takes your pick. In other words, there's no real consequence. Whereas what Van Til is pointing out is that, well, no, in the nature of the case, everything hangs on which way you go here on this great divide. Not only your eternal destiny, but the kind of life you're going to have on earth in fellowship with God or not in fellowship with him. So everything depends on this. It's not just a matter of your taste, your preference. Okay, this brings us to the section on page 167 that Bahnsen gives the rubric Revelation. According to Scripture, God has created the universe. God has created time and space. God has created all the facts of science. God has created the human mind. In this human mind, God has laid the laws of thought according to which it is to operate. In the facts of science, God has laid the laws of being according to which they function. In other words, the impress of God's plan is upon his whole creation. And I think this is explaining his earlier references to the plan of God. I think that the key point of when he drops the phrase the plan of God is not so much kind of the Calvinistic or Augustinian view of the decree of, the supratemporal decree of God by which all things are planned. It may couple to that, but here in the examples he just gave, he's talking about how God recapitulates himself or represents himself in creation by virtue of giving it its character. So the facts, have both substance and behavior and properties that he has imposed upon them. And the human mind is the same way. time and space themselves are artifacts of his creative activity. And so this whole universe of time and space and human thought and laws of physics and so forth are all impressed by the character that God, the creator, has given them, which in some sense reflects his character. And that's what Van Til is referring to chiefly as the plan of God. But it kind of leaves open, like on one interpretation of that, you could almost fall back on the natural law model, whereby nature kind of has the stamp on it that we can discover with our independent reasoning process. So that's what I would call kind of the conventional way to interpret Van Til here. Whereas the radical way to interpret this line of thought would be that we don't even have the grasp on facts or the ability to receive perception and generalize into concepts apart from the active enlightening of the Logos and the operation of the Holy Spirit. That's the view I take. I believe St. Augustine took that view as well. I hold the radical Van Tilian interpretation, but I suppose you could kind of take more of the moderate view, you might say, where, yes, God stamped all these things with characteristics that we call nature, and now man can kind of get along pretty well, which sort of seems to not be part of the genius of the Van Tilian critique. But I'm mainly just trying to bookmark that as a possible divide. Continuing. We may characterize this whole situation by saying that the creation of God is a revelation of God. God revealed himself in nature, and God also revealed himself in the mind of man. Thus it is impossible for the mind of man to function except in an atmosphere of revelation. And every thought of man, when it functioned normally in this atmosphere of revelation, would express the truth as laid in the creation by God. We may therefore call a Christian epistemology a revelational epistemology. So this paragraph, I think, pushes more toward the radical view, that there's an active revelatory aspect even to us attaining simple knowledge of the world around us. Even that involves enlightening by the Logos. And we're going to show that. We're going to show that. It's not just a claim. We're going to show that, like as Augustine did, that what is this thing called language? I mean, how is memory and language even possible unless the Holy Spirit implants it in us? We must now seek to define this revelational epistemology more closely by relating it still more definitely to the conception of him who gives the revelation. The all-important question is, what kind of a God reveals himself? Pantheistic thinkers also speak of God revealing himself, and might therefore also speak of a revelational epistemology, if they desired. But for the sake of clearness, the term revelation should really be reserved for a biblical thought. According to this view, God has been and is eternally self-conscious. There is no fringe of ignorance or darkness in him. So I think this is an important point, is that there are counterfeit religious systems that could claim to be revelational, that God is revealing himself, revelational epistemology. And it seems like Van Til is saying that we should just kind of, like, by definition, rule them out. But I think what he's saying more deeply is we should point out to the pantheist, for example, that a God that's kind of learning his own being as the universe evolves in space and time does not have the characteristics that we're talking about when we speak of revelation, because we need our mind to be in a posture of dependence such that we can rest epistemologically on the all-encompassing self-contained knowledge of God. So if he has things that he's trying to figure out also in areas of darkness, then we lack that prerequisite for foundational knowledge. Next, he has a section that he calls Correspondence. And we talked about this before, about how the correspondence theory of propositions, for example, and knowledge in general, is that there's a correspondence between our symbolic words that kind of function as constants and objects that are out there. And then the sentences that give a coupled relation between two different objects or an object and a property, and that coupling corresponds to a fact in the real world. So we have the mind objects of words, symbols, propositions, and then you have the facts and state of affairs in the world. And the correspondence theory says that, these two things need to correspond. So Van Til says under the title of that Bahnsen gives of correspondence, it is this concept of a completely self-conscious God that is all important in epistemology. This appears at once from the implications of such a concept for the fact of human knowledge. True human knowledge corresponds to the knowledge which God has of himself and his world. Now here he's going to launch into an illustration of how nested knowledge is, that even if you're trying to talk about, like, say, a cow that pulls with it these broader concepts and ultimately the whole universe. Continuing on page 168. Suppose that I am a scientist investigating the life and ways of a cow. What is this cow? I say it is an animal. But that only pushes the question back. What is an animal? To answer that question, I must know what life is. But again, to know what life is, I must know how it is related to the inorganic world. And so I may and must continue till I reach the borders of the universe. And even when I have reached the borders of the universe, I do not yet know what the cow is. Complete knowledge of what a cow is can be had only by an absolute intelligence, i.e. by one who has, so to speak, the blueprint of the whole universe. But it does not follow from this that the knowledge of the cow that I have is not true as far as it goes. It is true if it corresponds to the knowledge that God has of the cow. So I think this is interesting. It shows the problem of how our mere elementary logic does not really address the problem of knowledge, because to gain knowledge, you need to make judgments or propositions, assertions that certain propositions are true, or judgments. And as Van Til shows with this example of the cow, even the terms of those propositions implicate out into, you might say dialectically, further and further implications and ramifications, until finally the whole universe is involved. And as he says, even if we had the full knowledge of the universe, it still wouldn't be able to pick out the cow, except to the extent that we mirror the absolute knowledge of God. So I think this is, again, a way to illustrate the point Van Til is trying to drive home, namely that the relation of the finite mind to the divine mind is the key point of epistemology. From this presentation of the matter, it is clear that what we mean by correspondence is not what is often meant by it in epistemological literature. In the literature on the subject, correspondence usually means a correspondence between the idea I have in my mind and the object out there. In the struggle between the realists and the subjective idealists, this was the only question in dispute. They were not concerned about the question uppermost in our minds, i.e. whether or not God has to be taken into the correspondence. We may call our position in epistemology a correspondence theory of truth, if only we keep in mind that it is opposed to what has historically been known under that name. So I think it's clear what the traditional philosophers' notion of correspondence theory is and what Van Til's is. Van Til says, yeah, we need correspondence between our finite mind and the divine mind, whereas the secular philosopher is trying to cut God out of that picture and say, well, no, what we need is correspondence between, our symbols and objects and our propositions and states of affairs and so forth. We can kind of do that whole project, with God having been cut out of the picture. I think that's very clearly shows in what sense Van Til rejects correspondence and in what sense he affirms it. The next section, Bahnsen gives the title Coherence, which is kind of the alternate theory. In opposition to the historical correspondence theory of truth, there arose in the Kant-Hegel tradition the so-called coherence theory of truth. The idealists argued in the way that we have argued above about the cow. They said that true knowledge cannot be obtained by a mere correspondence of an idea of the mind to an object existing apart from the mind. The mind and the object of which it seeks knowledge are parts of one great system of reality, and one must have knowledge of the whole of this reality before one has knowledge of any of its parts. Accordingly, the idealists said that the thing that really counted in knowledge was the coherence of any fact with all other facts. To know the place of a fact in the universe as a whole is to have true knowledge. Now, of course, Kant wouldn't summarize his system in quite this way. He would say that his system is transcendentally ideal and empirically real. And then he shows, how his method couples those two in his proposal. But the German idealists in general, if you take that as an arc from Kant to Hegel, Schelling and Fichte and so forth, I think this is as good of a one-paragraph summary as you could make with regard to this topic. And what's interesting here is that Van Til ratifies that way of thinking about things to some extent. So he continues, "This position, as we shall see more fully later, approaches in form what we are after in our position. Yet it is only in form that it approaches our position. That this is true can be seen from the determining fact that the absolute to which the idealist seeks to relate all knowledge is not the completely self-conscious God of Christianity. We cannot prove this point here. We only state it as our conviction here in order to clear the ground. The absolute of idealism, we believe, is not really an absolute because he exists as merely correlative to the space-time world. Accordingly, there are new facts arising for him as well as for us. God becomes a primus inter pares, a one among others. He can no longer be the standard of human knowledge." So my own view is that what Hegel meant by the absolute is controverted as to whether it's the human mind or the divine mind or an asymptotic telos of any mind as it develops through the dialectics and so forth. So my own take on a Christian appropriation of Hegel is that we can see his dialectical unfolding of the structure of thought as a time-based reflection or prismatic reflection in time of the divine mind, which is self-contained and absolute and with no shadow, so that we can have a Van Tilian ontology and yet still at least work out or consider or have some point-counterpoint with the Hegelian approach to knowledge. So I'm not quite as truculent in my rejection of the idealists. I would look for a way to rescue their position by superimposing the Van Tilian view of the absolute. It is our contention that only the Christian can obtain real coherence in his thinking. If all of our thoughts about the facts of the universe are in correspondence with God's ideas of these facts, there will naturally be coherence in our thinking because there is a complete coherence in God's thinking. On the other hand, we hold that the idealistic coherence theory of truth cannot lead to coherence because it omits the source of all coherence, namely God. In a way, it might be well for us to call our position the coherence theory of truth, because we claim to have true coherence. Whether we call our position a correspondence theory or whether we call it a coherence theory, we have in each case to distinguish it sharply from the theories that have historically gone by those names. Accordingly, the determining factor must be a consideration of that which is most fundamental in our theory of correspondence or of coherence. Now, this depends upon the question whether we have God's knowledge in mind first of all, or whether we begin with human knowledge. For God, coherence is the term that comes first. There was coherence in God's plan before there was any space-time fact to which his knowledge might correspond, or which might correspond to his knowledge. On the other hand, when we think of human knowledge, correspondence is of primary importance. If there is to be true coherence in our knowledge, there must be a correspondence between our ideas of facts and God's ideas of these facts. So maybe one way to flesh out what Van Til is saying here is that in God's mind, there are many possible worlds, which, apart from creation, are all equally viable. When he says that for God, coherence is the term that comes first, you can think of that in terms of possible worlds, that each possible world in the mind of God has internal coherence, and that's prior to creation. So that when he instantiates one of those possible worlds in creation, now there's a type of correspondence which came after the coherence. Whereas for us, the correspondence, we can't jump out of our world. The actual world, which is possible, is also the only world that we can live in. So for us, the correspondence precedes coherence in a sense. Or rather, we should say that our ideas must correspond to God's ideas. Footnote 40, Bahnsen says, "This is an important sentence to keep in mind when one interprets or criticizes Van Til's doctrine of analogy, that man knows anything he knows, whether the world or God himself, by thinking analogously to God's thinking. God and man know the same objects or truths, according to Van Til, and the standard of truth for both God and man is the same, namely God's thoughts about whatever we know. This is far from being an avenue to theological skepticism or irrationality, as unsympathetic critics insist. Rather, Van Til said quite categorically that our ideas must correspond to God's ideas, even though metaphysically speaking, man's mind and ideas are not the same as God's mind and ideas." Continuing with Van Til. "Now, since we are dealing with opponents who speak of human knowledge almost exclusively, we can perhaps best bring out the distinctiveness of our position by calling it the correspondence theory of truth. An additional reason for this choice is that at the present time, the old correspondence theory has pretty well died down, leaving the coherence theory in control of the field. Well, I'm not sure if that's really the case in general. Hence, we have the advantage of a different name from the current name, since we are interested in making it clear that we really have a different theory from the current theory. So that's the point. That's the real point. Pick whatever name you want, but as long as we can explain what we mean by it. Okay, well, this took a little bit longer to get through. We covered the revelational notion and the general notion of Occam's razor, and that how it is that the relation between man's mind and God's mind is of critical importance with the theory of knowledge. And then we had an interesting discussion on the two main theories of correspondence, or of what we're aiming for in our system of thought, namely the correspondence theory and the coherence theory. Van Til had some interesting observations on each of those. So I'm going to stop there. Next time we'll cover his methodological observations, as well as the implication, induction, deduction, and the old historical a priori and a posteriori, to finish this section. See you then.